He stared grimly into his opponent's deep green eyes. Why wouldn't these people just leave him alone? In the past 3 weeks there had been 5 other attempts on his life. The warm pinkish, sandy beach where he lived was littered with their crystallized corpses. Do you think that wisdom is something you can steal? Aleavan sneered with contempt. His assailant said nothing but instead went straight into a shoulder roll and rose sharply near Aleavan's feet, swinging wildly at his face with his long saber-bladed claws. He was a short man, with blinding speed and brown Kevlar armor. Around his head was wrapped a blue and white streaked bandana, and there were several tattoos of occult significance on his neck. Obviously you wish to perish along with this sea of fools, Aleavan yelled angrily as he reached for the orb that hung from his thick, black, native leather belt. The orb was a fascinating artifact. It was the reason that the assassins and thugs had come. Knowledge of it had become public after Aleavan was forced to defend himself in plain view. The orb itself was about the size of a very small apple. Inside there was the constant visage of a thunderstorm over the briny waves of a long-forgotten ocean. Those who came to Aleavan's home supposed that it must contain the essence of his power, and to a degree that was true, but without the knowledge to accompany the will, there was no hope of gaining that power. Inside the water elementalist's object of focus, a lightning bolt struck the frothy green waves. Aleavan's will was amplified thousands of times and his attacker fell as a solid chunk of crystal to the ground in front of him. Fool, Aleavan said with a hint of resignation in his voice as he turned away and considered moving on from his seaside home. Aleavan was 82. His thinning blonde hair was beginning to turn grey, but his eyes were as sharp and clear as the day he was born. He wore a set of Aurorium link armor and carried no weapons. He tired of those who fought with him in themselves and despised the practitioners of the way of burning and the way of darkness. He had never become involved with a woman, as this would have interrupted his studies of the way of water. There had never been a time in his life where he had been satisfied with the knowledge that he possessed. He had learned under the wisest men that he could find, but eventually his sagacity would surpass theirs and he would have to move on. There was nowhere for him to go, he reasoned. Nothing left to learn but how much further society could sink into the depths of profanity. He was becoming more and more cynical in his old age and was not a man to be angered. He walked into the ocean, and then across the waves. Surely there is some worthy civilization across the great sea? He thought about it and then dismissed the notion. It was not long into his journey along the tops of the waves when Aleavan heard cries of distress through the medium of the water. They were high-pitched squeals and would have been undecipherable to most others even if they could hear them. The old water magician was appalled at what he heard. The native porpoises were calling for his help. It was almost 8 kilometers from his location, so Aleavan caressed his storm orb, and after the lightning struck the waves inside the microcosm, he was transformed into his favorite medium. The trick was to remain a cohesive entity amidst the rolling and pounding of the sea. Aleavan had mastered it many years ago, but some younger water elementalists are lost to the sea in this way. Flowing through the water, and using the undulating force of the waves to propel him forward, the rapidly moving pool the Aleavan had become was closing fast on the laments and cries of the intelligent porpoises. Native porpoises were one of the most psychically gifted non-sentient animals on the planet. They also possessed great mystical abilities, which helped keep them safe from both natural predators and man. Very occasionally, one would become ensnared in a trawler's net, but most often they would escape with a psionic blast. Today's was different, however, Aleavan surmised, as there were many calls and the outrage of their expression indicated that they were being specifically hunted. Aboard the Reha, a 35 meters factory ship, the crew were hauling in their catch. 17 of the pod had already been killed and were in the midst of being processed when Aleavan arrived. He immediately assumed his human form, observing the runic markings on the ship that were intended to neutralize the mammal's mystical abilities against it. She was an old vessel, hardly seaworthy, with rust around her keel and bilge holes. Aleavan took the storm orb once more and worked the most appropriate spell he could. The Rhea changed in hue from red and navy blue to a bubbling oxide in seconds. The superstructure caved into the hull as the rust spell swept over her. Men were jumping overboard as they felt the decks begin to give way under their feet. In less than a minute, the Rhea was a floating pile of debris and sinking rust chips. The remaining members of the family group of native porpoises dealt with the survivors, blasting them into pieces through the water with pent-up mental energy. They thanked Aleavan in their language and offered to escort him wherever he wished to go. Aleavan had no need of such a gesture and said, "Protect yourselves and this will please me." They agreed reluctantly to let the master of water continue towards air unassisted. It was several days later, after walking the shortest path over the sea, that Aleavan reached the shores of the island nation of Air. He sensed on his way that there was a smaller island where a great master of beasts was dwelling. In his wisdom, Aleavan did not divert his course to enter his domain. Air was a large island, inhabited by a fiercely religious population. The theology was based on pre-Ancient religion but had adapted significantly to allow for the local dinosaurs and extremes of environment. Their armed forces were amongst the best in the world, and their laws, though harsh in some instances, had a semblance of fairness. They embraced magic and were almost constantly at war with the Moravians, who did not. It was a beautiful place, filled with ancient forests and flooded swamps. Her ruler, Queen Monique of Air, had done a reasonable job of keeping the peace in the isolated country. Aleavan had heard much about the north of the island, where the forests would become flooded for many months of the year, and plenty of fish of wide varieties would swim amongst their roots. He was becoming old and craved new sights and experiences. The cliffs that he arrived at were sheer and shiny black. They rose vertically from the pounding waves to a great height. The sky was becoming grey and blackening rapidly as the wind sang through and over the salient rock. Aleavan used his storm orb and transformed into a vapor. He rose up slowly through the rain, which was invigorating to the old man. At the top he once again resumed his human form and began his journey into Air. If vengeance is what you seek, then it shall find you. The sounds of many impacts echoed throughout the region as Handalore was completely flattened and flooded. Rayla was shocked at the furious display of magic that he had witnessed. He was supportive of the destruction of the crowd, but there was one point that bothered him. "Why didn't you save the accused?" he said later. "They would have been watching had it not been them," Aleavan replied simply. Rayla thought about what his new master had said for a moment and then reluctantly agreed in his mind. Some of the cynicism of the old man was already beginning to rub off on the young apprentice. It wasn't until Aleavan had completely flooded the Gaul nation that he realized what he was ultimately going to attempt, a world filled completely with oceans. Everyone he had known in his life. Everyone he had ever talked to. He saw them in a different light now, like dirt on a clean floor. There was no place in his mind for compassion. Repeated exposure to human frailty had left him sick to the heart. There was nothing he could do except to hope that he would achieve solace in the destruction of all that lives on the land. He knew that eventually, he would run short on provisions and starve atop the waves of the new world, but he didn't care. There was some reassurance for himself in knowing that his abandonment of life was complete, and there would be no one left to answer to. A sweeping wave, hundreds of feet in height, continued its journey across Gaul toward Nefresia. Military vehicles and personnel were swept along with the massive tide. Gaul had also sent combat aircraft to deal with the Rouge Master. They had suffered the same fate as those from Moravia, being siphoned into a funnel of cloud and dashed on the water. Aleavan looked down passively as a great barn was rolling in the undertow of his massive wall of water. Bodies were undulating and spinning in the murky depths. He had been awake now for 3 weeks without respite. His clenched jaw ached with fatigue. It had become difficult to maintain the level of water. Aleavan was now vulnerable. Without time to recharge his magical reserves and physical powers, he would soon fall prey to the armed forces of Nefresia or worse, another master. This could not be allowed to happen, he reasoned. With every last ounce of energy he had, he became at one with the water once more, sinking and flowing with the current. The flood subsided quickly to the point where it was many pools in the valleys of coastal Nefresia. Aleavan could have been in any of these pools, but he was in all of them. In the days that followed, Nefresian warriors scoured the area for signs of the mysterious water magician. All reports came back as no incident and no trace of Aleavan was uncovered. There was only one individual in the area that knew he was still alive. He had sensed his extraordinary power when it became clear that Aleavan was breaking with order and sanity. His name was Arajakal. Arajakal had survived the last conflict, and his run-in with the Major and had established 3 new orders. One of these orders was on the hinterland of the North Nefresian coastline. Arajakal's students had pleaded with him to allow them to accompany their master on his journey to confront the master of the Way of Tides. He had refused them. It would be unwise. You would all be swept from existence by this individual, he answered as he left the flame-lit cave entrance. It was not a long journey, and its conclusion was guaranteed. Aleavan had also been aware of his opposite in the world. He had rested in his puddles for long enough to recover some energy, and he knew he would need it. Arajakal, in his deep scarlet woven utopian robes, held his trusty orange fire orb in the palm of his left hand. He was determined that he would not be taken unaware by the water elementalist that he knew was lurking in the valley. The sun was fading on the horizon and the shadows began to become indistinct. Ahead lay an area of sparse woodland with purple and black trees. Arajakal sensed some movement in his peripheral vision. Water. He could see that the many puddles were moving together to form a cohesive body. In a matter of moments, the transformation was complete and there they stood, two masters of their respective disciplines, ready to battle to the death, for there was no other way. Over and over in his mind was one salient thought, which rang through his consciousness as clear as a bell.